what is the third dimension of power?
Well, I have talked about power as existing, as best viewed in three dimensions. I suppose that's the most simple way of the quickest way of putting what I think about power. And it's because I think that if you think about power in a narrow way or one-dimensionally, you can then expand your view into a two-dimensional view. But my view is that power is best seen in three dimensions, and the point of it by using the little vocabulary of dimensions is to suggest that if you can see it in three dimensions, you're seeing further and deeper into the phenomenon. So I think of power as a difficult notion. We all use the word all the time, and we think we know what we're talking about, and we usually do. But people have different ways of understanding what power is. And the way I think about it is to urge the view that how we think about power is never innocent. It always carries with it a particular view of the world, a moral and political view of the world. And I think of power viewed three-dimensionally as a way of seeing further into the phenomenon. So time for a question.
All right, perfect. So I guess what differentiates the third dimension of power from, say, the first dimension and the second dimension? So I guess for folks at home, I will try to paraphrase these, so correct me if I'm wrong, but in the terms of the first dimension, it's very much confined to the political decision-making arenas, whereas when you get into the second dimension of power, you have, like, for instance, Bachrach and Baratz, who identify the addition of agenda setting as the sort of behind the scenes politicking that goes kind of outside the formal arena. But the third dimension of power, I guess, how does it differentiate? As I understand it, kind of goes quite a bit further, and as you mentioned, you can kind of see it in an entirely different light.
Thank you. You've helped a lot by going through that, and you've mentioned a few names. Maybe it does help to just explain the history of how I came to this idea of power being viewed in three dimensions. It all began in a debate, actually, among American political scientists in the 1960s, when Robert Dahl, whom you didn't yet mention, a famous political scientist who studied power in a city, namely New Haven, decided exactly as you say, that the way to figure out where power lies is to look and see who wins, who prevails when there are when the decisions are made. For example, decisions in the city council. And by looking at who wins, who prevails, by looking, in other words, at conflicts of interests that are observable, and asking who prevails over time, you can figure out who's got power. Power is just winning in that context. I mean, so I called that I came to call that the first dimension, because basically it captures the idea that if you exercise power over someone else, you have exercised power in that first sense. And you don't just have to think about it, as you suggested, in decision-making processes. I mean, all over in all areas of social life, when people get others to do what they want by, for instance, threatening them. Like, for example, if I hold a gun to your head and say, hand over the money, and you hand it over, yes, that's also first dimensional power, because it's observable. I want X, you want Y, you don't want to hand over the money, I get the money. That's very straightforward. Or if I win a vote and you lose, that again is very straightforward. Conflict of interest, observable. Now, as you also just said, and here you mentioned two authors, Bachrach and Baratz, they wrote a famous essay in the 1960s criticizing Dahl, saying, well, it's all very well asking who wins, who prevails over whom else, but actually there's another question lying behind that that's very important, namely, who decides what gets decided? as you said, I think a moment ago, that's the question of the agenda. Who controls the agenda? How is the agenda controlled? And that they call the second face of power. That's using the language of faces, not, as I prefer, dimensions. And that idea is basically that power consists in controlling, in being in control of what happens, what gets decided, what choices people make, what the alternatives are that people face. And that kind of power, if you like, call it, just to summarize it, the control of the agenda, that's the second face of power. Now, I then came into this debate at that point thinking, well, that's all very interesting and it's important, but there's more to be said, because that idea that I've just mentioned, the idea of there being a second face, namely the control of the agenda, doesn't get you very far, or at least not far enough. It simply asks who is controlling things or controlling what issues are up for discussion, but it still carries with it the idea that there's someone doing this that you can observe, and there are people who have grievances or demands that are being, as it were, kept out of or pushed out of the agenda of decision making. And I was interested in a set of questions which that perspective doesn't yet let us see. Namely, how do people's ideas and preferences and their beliefs get shaped and formed? What about asking the question, not which demands or grievances are kept out of the political arena or political decision-making arena, but asking instead, well, okay, what decides, or how is it arranged? How are political arrangements and social arrangements organized so that people don't even want certain things, don't even have certain beliefs, don't even have certain desires? In other words, the very shaping of the universe of possibility, that has to be brought also into the discussion of power. And it's that whole very large set of questions that I want to bring into the discussion of power. And I call it the third dimension, as I began by saying, because to see this thing three-dimensionally is to see further and deeper, or so I claim.
All right, well, thank you so much. And I guess another question would be, in terms of the preference shaping aspect of the third dimension of power, I guess this kind of, what does this mean for our contemporary society where, say, states, corporations have a lot of influence over kind of shaping the preferences of individuals throughout their life, right? And I guess we can maybe tie this perhaps into what Foucault kind of wrote about power in terms of the connection with knowledge, perhaps. And I guess Foucault, I think, understood it as it almost being inescapable, these sort of power regimes, but he didn't really see much potential for human agency within, or at least saw resistance very difficult. So I guess in the context of this, what are your thoughts on the effects of power from these institutions, these entities that sort of govern our lives, and what do you see in terms of the potential for human agency to kind of mold and shape those powers that be?
Lots of big questions you've asked. They're all in one, and they're all great. I think that Foucault is definitely a major thinker who thinks about, or at least earlier Foucault, because I think he did change, explores the area, the kinds of questions that have always interested me. But Foucault, in my view, goes too far. One way in which that has been shown in the literature is that people who like Foucault a lot talk about there being a fourth dimension of power. And I resist that, because I want to say that, you know, what I argue in my book on power, which is called Power: A Radical View, which has now just come out in the third edition, is I think that all the things that can be said and should be said without going too far, we can stay with the third dimension. Foucault wants to go further than I do. What do I mean? Well, you talked about the shaping of preferences, and that's one way to talk about what interests me, namely the ways in which people's ideas, their aspirations, their complaints, their grievances, what they care about and what they resent, all of that is in part shaped by power. That's what I claim. And the way that relates to the world we're in is, if you just think about what's happened in recent times in both where I live in the United States and in Britain, I'm thinking of the Trump years and about Brexit, is that people are very much influenced by powerful people, groups, corporations, also states, in ways that of which they're not necessarily aware, and which end up by affecting the way they think and make their choices. Now, a big danger in this way of talking is to suggest, this is something your question touched on, is that there's some way of discounting people's agency. It's somehow presumptuous. It assumes that people aren't in control of their own thoughts and their own lives. It's to claim somehow that you know better what people want than they do themselves, maybe. And I think that's a danger in thinking about power as shaping preferences and beliefs. But on the other hand, when people make this objection, and when they say to me, oh, you're being presumptuous or paternalistic, you're assuming you know better what people want than they do themselves, I respond to that by saying, look, are you really suggesting that power doesn't have these effects? So that if we think about, like I mentioned before, say Trump voters or Brexit supporters, but equally we could do it the other way around, but let's just talk, let's just say about, as it were, people with the opposite views to those. But I mean, all of us, I would say, are subject to the effects of power in shaping what we think and believe. And the box that I'm trying to open, or the questions that the third dimension of power is meant to raise, are how to investigate this. How are we going to try to separate out the ways in which people's aspirations, their beliefs, and their grievances are the product of power? And it isn't always going to be the straightforward exercise of power that you can observe. It's going to be often very subtle and even and very hard to identify. However, there's no doubt that it happens a lot. In other words, there are always, there are people at work and there are groups at work, and just think about propaganda as the most obvious example. Censorship is another very good example, where what people do affects how other people think and make choices. And the aspect of this that I focus on in the book is all those areas where you can think of power as domination. That's to say, where people are being affected by power in ways that go against their interests. And that raises all kinds of questions that I've tried to deal with over the decades that I've been writing about this. In other words, how are we really going to make an argument that people's interests are being acted against by the powerful? It's extremely difficult, but I resist the idea that that just never happens, because I would say it's obvious that it does.
All right. So I guess sort of along that same line, since the audience here is political science students, and we do organize together in student governments like IAPSS, and in our organization we try to help the student governments of other subjects in various countries around the world as using our political knowledge to help with student engagement, advocacy, and things like that.
Yeah.
So are there any, I guess, what would you recommend to political science students who may be watching in terms of how to resist that kind of power domination when the interests aren't aligned with what they need and what they want to see in their societies?
Yeah. Well, this is, I mean, the first thing I'd say was resist, yes, but first of all, figure out what's happening, what's going on. I mean, you've got to actually understand before you can start to think about successfully resisting. And I would say, I mean, I'd already said this, the most obvious examples of what I call three-dimensional power, or power viewed in the third dimension, is, of course, propaganda. And a very obvious example is, let's say, is censorship, where people are actually even prevented from knowing stuff that, if they did know it, would help them act on their interests. So, I mean, looking at how propaganda and censorship work is the most obvious thing. But what I am interested in, and this is where it gets interesting but tricky, is all those ways in which power in the third dimension, that's to say, to put this very simply, getting people willingly to submit to power that works against their interests. So we're talking about willing submission to power, where people are not fighting back, they are acquiescing. The difficult cases of where it's not something you can identify as propagandists at work, or the censors at work. It's something much more routine and unconsidered. It's the ways in which power can be at work, three-dimensional power, without it being intentionally manipulative. And that requires study and careful analysis. And the danger here, as I'm sure people listening to me or listening to all of this will immediately see, is this is opening the door unquestionably to conspiracy theories and talk of the deep state and, hidden agencies at work, and all of this suppositions, in other words, of the powerful manipulating us. For example, if you just think about the pandemic, all those people who are saying, and I say all those people, there are enough of them to make trouble, who are saying basically all this talk about mask wearing or vaccines, it's all people are being got to think things that are true by hidden forces or agencies that are at work. And so there's no doubt that if you think about power three-dimensionally, you're in danger of going down those rabbit holes. And so what I've always tried to say and deeply believe is that this has to be a topic, power, but also three-dimensional power, a topic for social science. That's to say, you have to have evidence carefully analyzed of how this power is at work and achieves its effects. So one example, and it goes back to something you were saying earlier, is a book I admire, but I'm also critical of. My criticisms of the book are in the third edition of my book on power, is a book by Shoshana Zuboff called Surveillance Capitalism, where she talks about the ways in which corporations, and in particular digital corporations, are at work in extracting knowledge, extracting stuff from us by observing our consumer behavior, for instance, and then getting us to behave in certain ways. That's third dimensional power. It is of course quite deliberate in the sense that it's got a whole science behind it. But that's a way in which we can see how we are actually being subject to power without our knowledge, and that the power is kind of invisible to us. In short, I mean, what interests me about the third dimension of power is that it's hidden, it's not overt, it's not obvious, like that first place of power that we talked about earlier, Robert Dahl and so on. It's at work, but it's no good just claiming that there are conspiracies at work, or thinking that there are, that there are evil forces that are manipulating us. We've got to actually study what's going on and come up with evidence.
Okay, and I guess the next question would be, what would you like to see in terms of the future of research on power, in both in theory and in perhaps more tangible academic works?
Well, there is a lot of work that you can gather together and see how it relates to all of this. I mean, although I didn't, by the way, say before exactly what my objection to Foucault was. And what my objection was, the reason why I thought, we could do all we need to do with the three-dimensional view, is that the fourth dimension in Foucault actually has him saying, at least earlier in his life, he would say things like, well, people's very being, their very identity, the very nature of the individual is itself shaped by power. And that seems to me to be going too far. I mean, of course, to some extent it's true, we are shaped, but Foucault wants to make it very total. And he even says things like power is everywhere. Power is everywhere at work. Once you say that kind of thing, you are, I think, not rendering it researchable. It becomes so omnipresent. It's like air or water. It's everywhere and you can't escape it. Well, then how do you study it? In answer to your question, I mean, I think we need to look at particular questions, the ways in which, and this is what I think Zuboff does, for example, the ways in which people are got to comply as consumers by active policies by corporations that have their own profit-seeking interests at work, and one of the things that does, and Zuboff doesn't really go into this, but it seems to me an interesting question, is the ways in which people are constantly being distracted by these powerful influences upon them, diverted from what they would otherwise seek and enjoy. In other words, there's a kind of attention economy, it's sometimes called, in which there's a competition at work for people's attention, and that this has the effect of actually acting against people's interests, in the sense that they would prefer, but then they don't have the choice, to not be endlessly distracted by all this three-dimensional power that's at work upon them. That's one example of a very difficult thing to study, but it seems to me very important. But we haven't even talked about the political side, which is also very important here. I mean, I think that, you only have to look at the story of Cambridge Analytica and the use of the digital sphere to have an impact on people's understanding of politics. I'm not just talking about the Trump election or Brexit, but I'm talking about, elections all across the world, because Cambridge Analytica was at work in lots of different countries, influencing politics. And there too, I mean, that, however, that has certainly been studied, is being studied by experts in that field. And that is only half the story. That's where it's manipulative and being conducted with purposes in mind. But power is also, three-dimensional power is also at work, as I said before, in routine and unconsidered ways. And that also, I think, has to be brought into the into the study of power. In other words, the ways in which civil servants and bureaucrats act in ways that are not, deliberately intended to have the effects they have, but they have them all the same. So it's a very wide range of topics, which it seems to me seeing power in the third dimension opens up.
And I know that you mentioned the third edition of your book on power coming out. So
Yeah.
I know that in addition to the surveillance capitalism parts, is there anything else that readers can look forward to in this new edition?
Yes, well, the very last section of the book, I refer to a body of research which is not well known in the mainstream political science and sociology literatures. And it's been developed by someone who was a student of mine long ago at Oxford. He's called John Gaventa, Gaventa. And he wrote a great book, which I recommend people to look at. It was written in the 1980s. And it's called Power and Powerlessness. And it's about the impact of what I call three-dimensional power on the lives of miners in Appalachia in the United States who were basically under the thumb of an international corporation that was basically ruining their lives, but securing willing submission for the most part, although there were revolts, by basically shaping their understanding of their world and limiting their access to alternative ways of acting and behaving. And this book of his, which still survives, I think it's a classic in its way. It's a book which was written then, but since then, John Gaventa, has been running projects, running a whole range of research by students of scholars of development across the world. And he developed something called the Power Cube. And the Power Cube is an elaborate, as it were, development of my three-dimensional conception. So it has, of course, as cubes do, 9 sides. And it's actually a way of trying to, make even more analytically usable this idea of power viewed not just three-dimensionally, but in different modes, which the Power Cube, without going into it now, I invite viewers and listeners to this to look and see. It's referred to in my book, but you could also find it online, powercube.net, I think it is. And there you'll see a research agenda for studying power in 3 dimensions. That's, I think, very fruitful.
I think they'll definitely appreciate that resource for sure. And I guess perhaps the last question that we have would be, is there anything else that you're researching right now or that you're kind of interested in that you'd maybe like to talk with us about?
Oh boy, well, there is, but I think it will take us beyond what we're doing, I mean, in a way, I feel I've shot my bolt on power for the time being. Anyway, I'm 80, and I think that, my book on Power Radical View came out in 1974, so I think maybe enough with power for the time being. Currently, I'm trying to figure out what morality is, so that's another whole topic. Which, we can talk about on another occasion if you like. But on the topic of power, I think, there's a massive literature, not to intimidate our viewers and listeners, but it's kind of interesting. It's worth dipping into it. In my book, I've got a guide in the new edition. There's a guide to further reading and also a bibliography, so people can see what's written.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We definitely would be happy to hear you talk about morality sometime. And I guess, yeah, it also, thank you for taking the time to share your thoughts with us. I'm sure that this will be of great benefit to political science students who are just learning about power, maybe those who are coming back to power to learn about things like the power cube and how, what I guess, how the research is developing and stuff. And I guess, perhaps as a final note, is there anything you would like to share with political science students before we go?
No, it's only really this last thought that I think I said before, which is I do strongly think that power has to be a topic for empirical research, not for ideological speculation. So that sometimes I've been accused of just seeing power wherever I want to see it or something like that. And I very definitely don't think this. I think that we have to, if we're going to make claims about the least observable, I mean, power interests me to the extent that it's in the third dimension, to the extent that it's inaccessible to and hard to observe by, or that it's hidden, in other words. And so I think the task of empirical research is to seek it out, is to find where it's hiding by finding evidence, which is often only going to be indirect. But in other words, rather than opening the door to conspiracy theories and the like, I think of the study of power as a way of contesting them.